Hello and welcome back. It has been a while. We've had a few challenges, but I want to get back on track with the videos. So I want to begin today looking at the book of Joshua. We're not going to spend a lot of time in the book of Joshua, maybe 4 or 5 different videos. But I want to introduce, first of all, the book, the major theme, the major purpose of this book. Really, the major theme of this book is regarding the promises of God. You see, God had promised, and we'll look at this text in a minute, God had promised to Abraham that he was going to give him a land. There was a land promise. And so the book of Joshua picks up with following the death of Moses. Joshua being the assistant to Moses, the right-hand man of Moses, and following the death of Moses, Joshua, the leader, will be the one who takes the Israelite people, after having left Egypt, after having wandered through the wilderness for 40 years, Joshua will be the one who will take the people across the river Jordan into the city of Jericho, capture the city of Jericho, which we remember the story of Jericho and the walls that fell. He will be the one that leads them into Jericho and ultimately leads them in battle, conquering this land, ultimately fulfilling the promise God gave to Abraham. So this book of Joshua is a story of promises being fulfilled. And again, having said that, what promise specifically are we seeing being fulfilled? Well, we're going to see a land promise. In the book of Joshua, the word land occurs about 107 times in the book of Joshua. Again, fulfilling the promise that God was going to give to Abraham's descendants, a land. It is also interesting to note that God had promised to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation. Actually, nations. But the nation of Israel is first mentioned as a nation also in the book of Joshua. So you have this aspect of Joshua fulfilling the land promise, but also the promise of becoming a nation. In taking of the land, Joshua would lead them in battle. And so there is this constant idea of Joshua being a conqueror in the land of Canaan. And so you'll have all these terms that are associated with war as Joshua comes in and drives out the inhabitants of the land. So you'll have terms for fighting or war. And so this will be a reoccurring idea in the book of Joshua. And these war terms, this war terminology will occur numerous times in the book of Joshua. So you have a land promise. You'll have this idea of war and conquering. But let's look at, first of all, the promise that's given in Genesis chapter 12, where the Lord is speaking to Abraham, and he tells him, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. So he's telling him, go to the land I'm going to show you, and I will make of you a great nation. So we have a nation promise. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So we have this aspect here. He says, go to the land that I will show you. Let's hop over to chapter 15, and let's look at this text. And it says in chapter 15, first of all, notice verse 16. This is not what we're going to talk about yet, but it's kind of interesting. And they shall come back here, so God talking to Abraham, they shall come back here in the 4th generation, meaning to the land that I have promised you. But here's the reason God wasn't giving the land to Abraham just yet. For the iniquity of the Amorites people is not yet complete. So God was going to fulfill the promise, but it wasn't going to be fulfilled in Abraham's time. God was going to do it in his time. Notice then verse 18. On that day, the Lord will make a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring, I give this land. So to the land of Canaan that he had earlier sent Abram to, he says, I will give you this land. Then he gives the boundaries from the river of Egypt to the great river, which is meaning the river Euphrates. And so he promises to give the land. And again, we see more of the land specifics here. So we have a boundary that's given. And again, kind of interesting to note. Let's hop over to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30. And it says here in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 20, so now Abraham is deceased. Now the Israelite people are coming out of Egyptian bondage, and they've been wandering in the wilderness with Moses. And it says, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice. So Moses is calling the people to this, holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days. Why should you do these things? Why should you love the Lord your God, obey his voice, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers. So you need to do these things so that you can stay in the land God promised to your father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them. So first of all, we again see this aspect of a promise about a land. We also see something else here that's kind of interesting, that in order for them to maintain and keep the land, for it to go well in the land, it was conditioned. And again, God's promises in Scripture are frequently conditional. And again, this promise is conditional. Conditioned upon what? Loving God, obeying his voice, holding fast to him. And then here's the condition, and here's the promise, that you may dwell in the land that God had promised. So we have this aspect of promise of a land given in Genesis 12. Go to the land that I'm showing you. You're going to be given the land, and he sets the boundaries from the river in Egypt to the great river Euphrates. And then here again, we have this promise of land conditioned upon their obedience to God, their love of God. And then when you come to the book of Joshua, and you come to the end of that book, and you see at the end of this book, it says, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers." They took possession of it. They settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their father. So we have this promise aspect, don't we? A promise was given to Abraham. We see it in Genesis 12, verse 1. We see it in Genesis 15, verse 18. We have the promise brought up once again in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30. Here in Joshua, the land has been done. The land promise has been given. The Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore. He says, he gave them rest on every side, just as he swore to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. We're not going to get into this right now. I know that later on there were some challenges in the land of Canaan when they came in. And so some people have said, well, did he give them all the land? Did he not? Because we see that some of the inhabitants stayed. Some of them were not driven out. God gave them all the land. And again, there are some time elements in this. At sometimes this promise of land was given. Other times they may have lost some of the land. For example, we know that the tribe of Dan went up and took their land, then they lost it. But God had answered. God had given them the promises. God had given them, and later on would give them the land all the way to the river Euphrates. And that promise wouldn't be completely fulfilled probably until the time of Solomon, and I'll show you that in a minute. But again, notice this promise becomes one of the key aspects of this book. Verse 45, not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. So the promises that were given, God fulfilled. There is, again, some time elements involved in some of these promises, as sometimes the land would be recaptured. Well, why? Why was it recaptured? Because the promises were conditional. Why was it recaptured? Because there were times Israel would abandon God. And so there was some back and forth on this, but God answered the promises. And the promise given in Genesis 15, verse 18, was that God would give them the boundary from the river in Egypt to the great river Euphrates. And we do see this fulfilled. Look at 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 21. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates, which was what Genesis 15:18 said, from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. You can hop over there from there to 2 Chronicles chapter 4. Oh wait, chapter 9. Sorry, wrong chapter. Verse 26. And again we read this. And he, talking about Solomon, ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And again, this is what God had promised Abraham in Genesis 15. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And so the book of Joshua is a book about God's fulfilling of the promise of land, the promise that he made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, that he expanded on in Genesis chapter 15, that he repeated to Isaac, that he repeated to Jacob, that was fulfilled, that was again repeated to Moses, repeated in the book of Deuteronomy, that was ultimately fulfilled. It was fulfilled in Joshua. It was fulfilled to its greatest extent later on under the reign of Solomon. But these promises that God gave, here is the point. God's promises were fulfilled. And what does that mean to us? That we have a God who fulfills his promises. That should give us comfort. Our God is a God who keeps his promises. Sometimes we fail to keep our end of the bargain, but God never fails. His promises he keeps. Thank you for your time. Please join me again next time. You guys have a blessed day.